to my mind, the more interesting, important work is what I named at the end of the book, the roots. So what are the kind of inner worlds we're each holding and collectively holding, and in our value systems, in our culture, that to my mind then create all of the other systems we're interacting with. And so digging into that, whether that's talking about kind of gender or our relationship to greed and money and sharing and all the kind of deeper questions underneath the economic system, or our relationship to nature and spirituality and mental health. And that is probably where I would root hope, is back in the kind of what we can do locally and internally, and the responsibility we can take in our own lives and our own relations and communities, and try and practice the values that ultimately we want to grow into or towards in the world at large, that we're trying to practice and cultivate them in our own lives.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with me, Dan Burgess. The story of Spaceship Earth is simple. We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. Like a spaceship, we have a finite amount of supplies with an intelligent operating system called nature, which keeps everything replenished as long as we all respect it and participate wisely. In this podcast, I'm in conversation with folk involved in regenerating life, shifting consciousness and reimagining how we can live more beautifully and peacefully. I talk with artists, writers, activists, designers, adventurers, healers, farmers, creative mavericks, and more. Their stories invite us to participate in the co-creation of life-sustaining cultures, in service to life, becoming crew on Spaceship Earth. Greetings, Earthling. Welcome to the Spaceship Earth podcast. This is Dan, your host. Thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you being here. If this is your first time to the podcast, welcome aboard. I hope you enjoy the trip with us. If you're returning, welcome back. We really appreciate your ongoing support. And thank you for being here. Before we get into this episode, a couple of things. As you know, this podcast is in its 6th year, the Spaceship Earth podcast. We have been entirely self-funded to date. We switched on listener support a couple of months back via our Substack, becomingcrew.substack.com. And some of you are converting, upgrading to a paid subscription or donation. Thank you so much for those that continue to do that. It's massively appreciated, but we need more of you. It costs a lot to make these podcasts happen, and we're pretty good. We're pretty resourceful at getting these things out, but it still takes a lot of time and cost. And we are advertising free, but we need more support. So if you can afford the price of a pint of beer a month or a couple of takeaway coffees, you'll be supporting the ongoing recording, production, release of these episodes, the writing on our Substack, the community gatherings that we organise and offer out. So yeah, it'd be awesome if you wanted to do that. So, back to this episode. In the last couple of weeks, we've had World Environment Day, World Ocean Day. Now, these days are useful to draw attention towards this living Earth that we are part of. But I also feel they're problematic because they continue to other us as the human, separate from the living Earth, the environment, the ocean that we are intimately entangled with. So, for example, as I sit here with this microphone in my hand, speaking to you, every second breath I take is incoming oxygen which is coming from the ocean. Because at least 50% of the oxygen we all breathe is generated in the ocean. Yeah, that oxygen is utterly dependent on a multi-species relationship in the ocean. And that multi-species relationship is utterly dependent on stable climate. So everything there is interacting, is interconnecting, and is in relationship. So my ability to sit here and breathe in oxygen to record this podcast is down to the health of those relationships to generate that oxygen. The ability of the phytoplankton to be in relationship with the krill and the whale and the sun and the climate. I inter-am with all of those other beings and the biosphere itself far out. So the question is, where do I start and where does the ocean begin? You know, the environment is not over there. I am the environment. I am 57% non-human cells. I am 20 million non-human genes in my microbiome. I am the bacteria in my gut. I am the wild yeast on my hands that creates the wildness in the sourdough bread that I bake every week. This separation logic is the challenge of our time because it underpins everything that we have designed and built and the belief systems of modernity that dominate our cultures that are driving the ongoing destruction of the very living earth we depend upon and are entangled with. We are not separate individual selves. We are entangled relational beings who are being shaped by the very context we find ourselves in. How can we learn to trust this great mystery and open ourselves back into relationship with a wilder web of intelligent and interdependent life within us and around us? Because until then, we continue to perpetuate the violent and destructive relationship between the atomized self, between each other, and between the wider living world. We continue to other the very things that we are intimately entangled with and that our health is utterly dependent upon. We are the environment. We are ocean. We are nature. We inter-are, as they say at Plum Village, when we learn to let go of the story of separation, the illusion of separation, and begin to relate to life in new ways, to ourselves, to each other, to the wider living more than human world, when we begin to carry a story of interbeing. So, this brings me to this episode and my guest, Lily Cole. Lily Cole is many things: a model, an activist, an author, an actor, a writer, a social entrepreneur, a mother, and someone who has campaigned and acted for environmental and social justice throughout her career and is deeply committed to working towards cultures of care, connection and solidarity between all humans and the wider web of life. I first connected with Lily about a decade ago when we were both working on gift economy projects, and we reconnected properly late last year at a climate activism retreat at Plum Village, the Zen Buddhist monastery in France, and have really appreciated her presence. We recorded this conversation back in May. It's a conversation grounded in this moment, which explores our own inner roots, our relationality with all life around us, and what might happen when we commit to the ongoing practice of seeing ourselves as intimately entangled with the living systems we are part of and of the futures we imagine. Hope you enjoy this one. This is the Spaceship Earth podcast with Lily Cole.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with my dad, Dan Burgess.
Lily, welcome to the Spaceship Earth podcast. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Whereabouts are you on Spaceship Earth right now?
I am at home in Lisbon, in Portugal. Where are you?
I am in the spaceship shed at the bottom of my garden in the city of Bath, UK. Yeah,
Very nice.
My usual hangout. I was actually out this morning. I don't know how it is with you, but the last couple of days we've had this kind of like, sort of emerged from this kind of grey kind of wetness that's just been ongoing, and this is sort of like real, like everything's just, the sun's come out and there's just green everywhere. And I was up this morning at 5:30 just sitting in the garden,
Beautiful,
and watching the sun come up over the hill, and I felt like very kind of very blessed. How are you showing
amazing
up today, right now?
Right now, I'm feeling good, actually. I had a run this morning. I started running, the new thing. I was traumatized by running, I think, in childhood, by running for so many buses. I assumed I could never run. And then about 2 weeks ago, I started running very slowly and discovered that running very slowly I can handle. Anyway, I had a run. I meditated, did some work, and now I'm here. So yeah, a good start to the day.
Nice. So, question I've been kicking off the conversations this year with my guests is in the kind of spirit of really trying to sort of get, perspectives, right, how people are experiencing things right now. I've been asking this question, like I've been using this word vibes, right? You might use another word, but for me, I'm sort of saying, like, what are the kind of vibes that you're experiencing yourself right now on this metaphor of Spaceship Earth?
I love that you use the word vibes. That's hilarious. That's so new age. Good vibes, bad vibes. It's a real mix, If I stay hyper local in my way of seeing and feeling and observing, then the vibes can feel pretty great. I'm blessed in many ways with beautiful people in my life. I love living in Portugal. And there's just like a long list of reasons I could feel very grateful for things. But of course, we are interconnected with the wider world. And every time one looks at the news or even from social media and therefore sees news through it, of course, it's very disturbing to see, how many challenges we face as a global community and how much suffering there is happening, whether that wars that are happening right now or the impact of climate change and the trajectories of climate change. And that can feel quite overwhelming. And so, it feels like strange to hold those different parallel realities together. And maybe that's always been the way in life. Obviously, it's different today, for many different reasons, the circumstances of today, but the polarities of positive and negative have arguably always been there. And you look at ancient spiritual texts, and that dualism is sort of maybe inherent to reality. But sometimes it feels very difficult to acknowledge the extremes of the dualities in our world today. What about for you?
Yeah, all of what you just said, and that as I say, my little microcosm right now, as I said, like even this morning, walking out and just experiencing all this extraordinary kind of energy and sort of growth and aliveness that I was experiencing in my little patch on Spaceship Earth right now, in this kind of just watching all this life doing its spring thing and seeing this, as I say, the sun coming up over the hill this morning was just really quite extraordinary. And then I had that, I was sitting with the sun warming my face, and then I had that in my mind, took me actually to where I'd been scrolling the night before, images in Rafa and babies being sort of pulled out of rubble with the same sun shining on their families. And I think yesterday as well, there was the Guardian and piece of research that was put out, where they've done this kind of survey with, the few hundred leading climate scientists around the world to have a very sort of personal survey, of like actually how are you seeing things. And obviously this idea of still of this sort of the narrative of keeping things below 1.5 degrees, and they're all like, that's just insane. We're looking at we're looking, pretty much unanimous. That group was unanimous in its like the acceleration of the heating is happening so fast. And so I think, again, those are just two things, right, that were very live for me. But again, that same thing of how to hold all of this, all of this kind of conflicting setting, and then also all the possibility and all the joy and all the kind of awe that I am experiencing to be alive at this moment. And so it's kind of just, I find that is really just that's becoming the norm, how to sit with all of this and how to not let that overwhelm is my sort of daily challenge.
And I don't know if I'm twisting it around to interview now, but I'm curious. Do you feel that more extremely today in the circumstances we're in today than in previous years and previous decades? As somebody, the little that I know you, somebody who's been very kind of socially active in the climate scene for a very long time, I'm sure you often had an eye to the global picture as well as the beauty and the joy. So yeah, do you feel like it's becoming more extreme or intense, or do you feel that's just been a kind of consistent thread of your life?
It's a good question. I think it's maybe the what would someone call it, the cognitive dissonance. I think it's the kind of like still the sort of the blindness, or the seemingly the sort of the blindness, the deaf, I don't know what you would call it, but in the kind of mainstream culture of politics and media and business as usual, that this stuff it just seems like it's getting, impossible. I mean, I don't know how, I don't know what people do to sort of not notice these things. So I think I find that the extremity of both the sort of urgency and impact, and then seemingly the extremity of a desire for the world that we've worlded, or that has been worlded over the last few decades, to want to keep going as if this stuff it's not really happening. Does that make sense? So I think that's the bit I'm finding more, the extremity of sort of what is unfolding, and how parts of the sort of, or the dominant culture seems to be rooting even deeper into sort of denial. But of course, I recognize under that all kinds of stuff sits, which all kinds of things are happening that I can't know or understand, where a significant shift away from that these destructive ways of showing up can come from. So, but I think that question of looking back at this moment, I do feel that there's these real extreme, it feels very extreme, the moment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. And the ways in which we be like aware of the contradictions and then not necessarily know how to redress them, and sort of just sit with them. Like seeing many people pointing out in my feed this week the kind of the contrast between seeing images from the Met Gala in the US alongside the images from Gaza, and just the kind of intensity and of that contrast visually, as a visual language that's very dominant in the media today. And yeah, it's uncomfortable, and then also what does one do with that discomfort, and also with the way in which those maybe contrasts and contradictions play out in our own lives and our own value systems, and the mental space we give to kind of global issues versus the mental space we give to our own personal dreams and aspirations and desires. The complex thing to be alive.
Yeah, it is. And you've just from what you said there, that the contradiction between what is out there and then what is happening inside and in front of us and in our homes, and that's actually what I find. Yeah. And now you're speaking to the thing that can be so exhausting, because there's also this element of, at least what I've been trying to work with over the years, because this stuff has many times overwhelmed me, as I'm sure it does with lots of people, and start bringing it into the home. And I can see the sort of system issues playing out within my own home environment. And it's kind of like this, trying to be gentle as well with going, do you know what? There's stuff that's going on that is just almost, it's so pervasive It's kind of like, what do I need just to allow to be in this moment versus where I can actually show up differently. So I think that the contradiction is alive everywhere, not just out in the big systems, but it's kind of playing out at a very personal level as well.
We re-met recently at Thich Nhat Hanh, Plum Village in France, the beautiful week of gathering of people working in the climate space. Kind of encountering Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings and how they might be applied to the climate problem and or in life. And I feel like this topic we're talking about now came up a lot during that week. The connection between inner world and the outer world, and the way that we might show up in kind of as activists or environmentalists or whatever the word might be. And also this message of like the importance of enjoying life and appreciating the beauty all around us, you know, whether it's just small gestures of nature or sunshine or relationships, etc. Like the importance of kind of honoring that beauty and that joy whilst also holding space for the bigger, wider, more upsetting narratives of our time.
So much in Plum Village, isn't there? We could probably spend this whole conversation talking about Plum Village, but you know, we ended up as washing up buddies. Do you remember? But you know, connecting with you at Plum Village, and then we've had some connection over the years through, well, back in sort of, I think it was 2011, or you know, you were starting Impossible, I think, at the time, around this sort of gift economy type ideas. I was with my fellow co-founders building Good for Nothing, and I think we'd had some vague connectivity around then, and I was fascinated with the Impossible project. And then, you know, I think 2020, was it? You published your Who Cares Wins book, which I'd love to dig into a bit of that. And then obviously then we connected at this Plum Village retreat and ended up contemplating many of these things over the washing up. I don't know how that has washing up carried on for you. Is that what have you taken away from that experience in Plum Village? I'm quite kind of interested in chatting to people who've been there and, you know, what practices they've managed to sort of keep playing with.
Hilarious. Has washing up continued for you? I mean, I must admit,
you know,
I have a dishwasher. So I wash wooden spoons and wooden, you know, and some pots and pans sometimes. So I do wash up occasionally, and maybe I don't do it as mindfully as I should. Thank you for the reminder. I think I'm going to practice more mindfully next time. And when you mentioned our experience of being washing up buddies, it's very like suddenly resonant for me, the memory of washing up with you and chatting with you. So it really did work a treat, you know, like it became a really powerful part of the experience that we would have deep conversations while washing, like, you know, the pots for 100 people, 150 people, 200 people, how many people were there? The one that probably stuck more, I was more intentional about trying to keep after Plum Village was meditating, and so having a more like kind of regular meditation practice. And so I have been trying to do either daily or every few days meditation since, and that's like, wow. I mean, I knew that already before Plum Village how important that is for me, but it was a good reminder to get back into that.
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. Silence for me has been something as well. Just trying to have, you know, to sort of recognizing like the power and the kind of silent spaces and the silent times, and then the walking meditation as well. I've found really, really interesting to play with, and actually have been kind of introducing that to lots of other folks I've been collaborating with as just a way, you know, who maybe sort of explore, you know, sort of thinking about this kind of inner outer relationship, and actually mindful walking seems to be a really interesting way in as a practice that can maybe work, is more accessible sometimes for folks. But so yeah, so much has come through that experience. And actually after we met, I did decide to give I hadn't read your book Who Cares Wins, but I did after Plum Village get a copy. And I think because it was 2020 it came out. 2020 was a bit of a mad year. Well, it wasn't it was the pandemic, wasn't it? There was a lot of stuff going on in my
It came out in the midst of the pandemic. Yeah.
But I mean, there's so much in this book. You must have it's really dense in terms of like insight, information, reflection. You connecting with a lot of people from all kinds of parts of the systems. Quite fascinating, from sort of, entrepreneurial and sort of technological, into sort of wisdom teachers and activists and indigenous cultures, and so many perspectives, which I really appreciated. And I'd love to talk more, particularly to that other, I guess the final part of the book. I'd love to spend a bit of time on, if we could, because that feels really alive for even what we're just speaking to. But just for listeners, I just wondered whether you could give a few kind of a little bit of the backstory of how this worked, because it's not just the book, it's your work with Impossible. And I guess this, for me, maybe it's in the word care, right? There's this kind of sort of quality of care that's been really has been very alive in your life, and has kind of led you to these projects. I'm guessing there's something in that, but reading the book, you've got quite an activist family, but I just wondered whether you could just give a little bit of the kind of seeds and threads that have got you to this place of inquiring into this area of how do we move beyond these systems that we now understand to be as destructive as they are. What was the pathway around that sort of got you to this work?
Yeah, of course. So I started writing the book Who Cares Wins, I think 2016, and so it was a few years in the making. And the first part I wrote was actually about Impossible, so it was about the gift economy project, and the reason why I'd sort of become so obsessed with that idea for several years of my life, and all the research I'd done into gift economies from a kind of sociological, psychological, economic, political, cultural perspectives. I'd done a huge amount of research and wanted to sort of map that together, which I did for one chapter of the book, and that experience and why I did it, and why I still feel that gift economies and gift cultures are a very important part of how we may think about relating in healthy ways to one another on this spaceship. And then I broadened the book into many other areas. As you mentioned, I gave myself a huge amount of work by trying to cover like other sectors like food and politics and waste, etc. Partially, I think, driven by the sense that I've been working at that point in kind of loosely the kind of environmental climate movement for maybe 10 or 15 years at that time. And I had seen a lot of really positive trends and a lot of emergent ideas and technologies and possibilities that felt like they were getting traction. And at the same time, the science was becoming ever more scary, and the narrative in the media was becoming ever more dystopic. And I think in a way I wanted to sort of point out that, yes, the problem is terrifying and there are many reasons to be very pessimistic, but actually there are tons of people and organizations and communities and even sometimes companies and politicians trying to work on solutions. And that if we focus actually on solutions and we give those our energy, our votes, our money, our time, whatever the ways in which we might put solutions, they are more likely then to thrive. That was sort of the premise of it, drawing on the fact, that I was somewhat optimistic. It felt like many things were going in a better direction from what I'd experienced and researched and seen. And then the other sort of way in which I approached writing it was, as you mentioned, looking at different perspectives. So aware that this is, a gargantuan problem that's sort of overwhelming to think about, and I would find it unwise if anybody thought there was this kind of simple solution or an easy solution or advocated a solution, and that we have to sort of embrace the complexity of the problem and collaborate and communicate in order to find the ways through solutions. And so in every different area of the topic, if you look at food, for example, you look at the meat industry, as soon as you open that kind of can, you find tons of environmentalists who have very different perceptions or perspectives of how to go about solving the problem. And I guess I wanted to try really exercise restraint in jumping to opinions and conclusions, because I do like feel very humble in the scale of the complexity of the problem. And so instead wanted to offer the different perspectives and offer the information and the research I could find. Of course, sometimes my opinions creep in, but I tried to not be opinionated and just to hold a space where there was the possibility of dialogue and debate between different ideas, hoping then that the reader can find their own way through that material.
Yeah, you did that really well. When I was reading it, I was like, God, I would just be like, there's a calmness about how you kind of presented some very different ideas. So well played with that one.
Thank you. Well, I also do think it, like debate is such an important part of our society, and I think it's actually a real problem that in many ways we're becoming so polarized, that a lot of the very important debates of our time have been politicized, polarized, and people end up kind of often going into kind of camps of holding a perspective or other that can then go, I find, more extreme in the polarization. And so I was trying to do the opposite of that, of like actually seeing the importance of different opinions and the importance of different perspectives, that actually that's healthy, and a kind of healthy functional part of democracy and our society is to bring together different voices.
And when you look back now, and obviously it's 4 years on since that book was published, so I'd love to know, like, I guess thinking back now, what has emerged in these last 4 years when you think about that project? Have things you anticipated happened? Have your assumptions shifted? Are there changes that have happened that you could never have anticipated? And I guess what's still really alive for you in going through a project like that? Because you must have got, like you say, you've tried to sort of to hold space for different views and different opinions. But I guess I'm curious as to the things that at the time felt really kind of alive for you. And I'm just wondering, like, how has that played out over the 4 years? Which elements of this inquiry feel, still like for you, where you feel there's real sort of possibility? Going back to that word possibility, which is a word you actually use quite a lot. It's possibilities and stuff. So I guess I was just curious about, like looking back, what feels disappointing or hasn't quite gone the way you had anticipated, and what feels really alive still in this inquiry.
I think, to be honest, it's too soon to say. I think that 4 years is sort of a blink of an eye in a way. Like a lot of the issues and trends I'm looking at, I think probably require a much wider, longer view to see how things play out. Also, I haven't read my own book recently. Maybe I should to do a kind of sort of like analysis on where I feel the same, where I feel differently, where, how things have changed, in what direction. I certainly still hold within myself many of the, I think, tensions and contradictions, but also values that I articulated in the book. And some parts of maybe our reality make me feel less hopeful today. The way the political system sort of just seems to ignore voices, the fact that our democracy doesn't feel very functional in terms of listening to people. But that was also something I looked at in the book is, what are alternatives? How could we upgrade democracy? Looked at the Swiss system of direct democracy as an example, and also how digital could help us upgrade democracy so we actually listen to citizens more, politicians listen to citizens more. There's this kind of growing, it feels like the kind of awareness of the environmental crisis and climate change feels like it's continued to grow and become dominant in mainstream society and narratives, and that's in many ways positive. I feel like that was the kind of real shift, and that was happening while I was writing the book, like 2018, with the IPCC reports that came out that year, the Extinction Rebellion, the school climate strike movement that was born afterwards. I feel like that was quite a pivotal moment, and I feel like that we've seen ripple effects kind of continuing since, whereas 10 years ago, maybe there was a lot of climate skepticism and environmental conversations felt pretty niche. Obviously, I'm not saying there wasn't an environmental movement, that was a huge one, but it was relatively niche to the mainstream, and it feels like it's become increasingly mainstream. And yet we have probably more and more cognitive dissonance and things not necessarily changing at the pace at which the climate is changing and the physics sort of demands change. And And I think that what feels most alive is probably actually the stuff that's toward the end of the book. So I love that you honed in on that section. It's not surprising, actually, given the ways in which we've connected over the years. That, for me, was probably the most important part of the book, and I considered it bringing it to the very beginning. And it's the kind of the deeper stuff, the muddier stuff, the value stuff, the, like, you know, the energy systems we use, the transport systems we use. Like, I could sketch ideas and possibilities and technologies, but that's quite surface level in a way. Important, but quite surface level. You know, whether this technology or energy system becomes dominant over this one, what pace of change is relatively surface. To my mind, the more interesting, important work is what I named the end of the book, the roots. So what are the kind of inner worlds we're each holding and collectively holding, and in our value systems, in our culture, that to my mind then create all of the other systems we're interacting with. And so digging into that, whether that's talking about kind of gender or our relationship to greed and money and sharing and all the kind of deeper questions underneath the economic system, or our relationship to nature and spirituality and mental health. So yeah, those are the areas that I explored at the end of the book, and that I think probably for me feel very alive and resonant. I think I've gotten also one small thing, well, small, but I've gotten more into organic too. I wrote a bit about organic in the book, but I think since publishing the book, I've become more and more convinced actually of how important organic regenerative agriculture is as a solution, which then connects to the kind of nature and rewilding piece, you know, and how important that is. That feels, quite alive to me.
We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. How bonkers is that? You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast.
If you'd like to support the running of the Spaceship Earth podcast, head over to our Substack and sign up. You'll get every episode straight to your inbox, weekly writing, plus other crew offerings. We're grateful for whatever you can give. Join us at becomingcrew.substack.com. Yeah, I think you framed, isn't it? The roots are the real solutions inside us, as the sort of question for that section, which I loved. And it's very much kind of where, you know, the inquiring I'm doing on the podcast and in the wider work has come very much back to that place of, like, you know, I spent many, many years kind of like, you know, outward campaigning and trying to mobilize and, you know, create things with people to kind of solve the problems. And there's all good. There was a lot of amazing stuff that comes through those kinds of work, but this real sense of like what's going on inside us and how much of that, that dance between the inner and the outer, I guess. And where I've got to over the last few years is seeing what is the real crisis here. You know, for me, I have been really interested in this relational problem, a relational crisis, if you want, or that's one way to start exploring, because we've kind of built these worlds over the last 50 odd years, particularly where everything has massively accelerated, but it's probably been a few hundred years in the making, and we're living in these realities that were constructed from our ancestors' imaginations and the contexts that they were in. We're in those worlds, you know what I mean? And part of that world was constructed relating, perceiving, seeing ourselves as quite separate and removed, and from the living world, from each other, from people that don't look like us. You know, everything was kind of, you know, based on a kind of a way of relating, and then a way of storing that relationship that then informed a lot of the designs of the structures and the systems and the beliefs. And so for me, there's this kind of like, without really exploring how we've been perceiving, how we've been relating with everything, which is why it can be overwhelming for people, but, you know, almost everything, right? Like who we are, like our relationship to the natural world. Are we part of it? Are we separate from it? But without really beginning to shift those relationships, to kind of reimagine them, to show up and relate in new ways, my sense is that we keep designing and behaving, and we're just perpetuating almost You know what I mean? Which is almost a crisis that is happening at a relational level. But I think why I really connected with that section, the real solutions inside us, and so I'm really interested in how can we hold that type of inquiry within a world that is unraveling because of a way of kind of thinking, perceiving, whatever, that has built it and constructed it in this way. And so how can we sort of hold all of that complexity but begin to work at this relational level to try and impact change? And so where I got to with the work is with that, you can do campaigning work and mobilizing work, and it's all good, but unless we're sort of operating, unless we're working on ourselves and our relationships with each other and who we're showing up. And that's why I'm really intrigued by this frame of care that you have through the book, through your podcast, because it sort of struck me that in some ways this kind of this world that we are in a kind of westernized, very capitalized world has actually been worlded by capital. And so I'm really interested in what does a world look like that's created with care, and how do we do that? Because care requires attention, and attention requires time, and we're in this kind of world where that's really hard to find, because we've commoditized time. And so anyway, that's my sort of neurodivergent sort of ramble on this area of your work and inquiry. And I just wondered whether we could sort of dig into that roots thing and just maybe speak to some of the projects or themes or ideas that are quite alive for you now. And even like the gift economy, I sort of feel like, the gift economy sort of felt like it was all happening, but we know that it's kind of like, it's how societies and cultures have always functioned for the majority of time on this earth.
It became the projects we were part of. I feel like there was no moment of excitement around these tech projects that were trying to encourage the gift economy in different ways. And to my mind, it sort of got usurped, that energy, into the sharing economy, so into monetized, the success of very capitalist kind of monetized versions of those instincts. I'm not saying they're all bad. I think there's a lot of good with them, but the success of Airbnb and car rental platforms and things like that maybe usurped some of the energy that we were trying to tap into with our project. And I think that's its own conversation also about the realities of how expensive it is to run a tech company, and therefore the capital that's required, and therefore the capitalism that those systems inevitably become part of to become successful. But I would say the gift culture, gift economy, I think it's also important to recognize it's just there all the time, regardless of technology, like people helping neighbors, friends, strangers, anything that people do that's not monetized, which is a lot of things, are part of that economy. And that shadow economy is calculated to be bigger than GDP, and it's there, just maybe need to notice it. In terms of the areas you were exploring just now, what was coming to my mind was maybe the difference between recognizing we are all entangled and we are all connected. What Thich Nhat Hanh, I think, would recall interbeing, the kind of interbeing of all reality. The fact that the cloud and the tree and the flower and the compost, but also that we're interbeing with everything else. When we eat a plate of food, we're eating the element that made all of that food, let alone between human relationships. That mindset and that philosophy and that way of understanding our position in the world, how distinct that is from the sort of dominant narrative of our culture that has many times suggested we are sort of atomized individuals who are largely self-interested and competing within this weird game for our own interest. And I mean, there are different theories of how that latter mindset came about. Like, arguably, a lot of indigenous mindsets are more the former, so an animate world. The animals as our kin, that we're deeply interconnected and dependent upon the natural world around us, and therefore have to have very different relations with the world around us. It's kind of messages you see in many, many different indigenous cultures around the world, and in anthropological research about cultures that are no longer with us. And then my understanding is that, it's very complex, but quite often people kind of look at the Enlightenment, in quotation, and the kind of Descartes perspective, and then how the philosophy and the science of that era was then maybe utilized by the economics and the politics to suggest that humans were better than other species, different to other species in this kind of very hierarchical model, and separate to other species, as well as maybe separate largely to each other. And that kind of fundamental philosophical worldview has arguably driven many of the economic political systems that we are still part of today, from colonialism and capitalism into what we have today, which are more evolved versions of those systems, but ultimately connected to those systems, emerged out of those systems. And so I think it's interesting to think, about those maybe two different worldviews, ontologies, and for my mind, draw a lot of hope from the fact that many people, many writers, many thinkers are calling attention to the need to look back to, or look forward to, more interconnected ontologies. And that seems to me like becoming, like it feels like maybe I'm in my own bubble, but it feels like there's a growing space and dialogue for shifting that perspective. And if we continue to grow in that direction, then how will that have ripple effect in our cultures, in our societies? I think is an interesting question to consider. One other thought I'll share that came from when I was saying that is I've done a few different projects with Indigenous communities, like organising Indigenous listening sessions, spent time with Indigenous communities. And in one of the Indigenous listening sessions I was working at, there was a man who had spent time with different Indigenous communities around the world, Canada, Australia, I think potentially another one too, for many years. And I asked him if, in my journey of looking at Indigenous cultures and literature, it seems that, of course, there are many, many differences, but there are also some similarities that seem to emerge that are quite interesting. But I don't really feel it's fair for me to be the one that suggests what those similarities might be. And I asked him his perspective, if he felt there was any kind of similarities between the Indigenous communities that he knew well and spent time with. And it was really interesting, his answer. His name was Sean Wilson, and he said that he felt that, there was an Indigenous ontology that was different to the Western ontology, and it was fundamentally a relational ontology. The reality is relational. And there's something about the simplicity of that I really loved. Also reminded me of I interviewed Carlo Rovelli on my podcast, and we spoke about he talks about the relational nature of reality that quantum physics seems to suggest. So it's also sort of beautiful to see how these very, very ancient worldviews sort of map to the most groundbreaking science of our day, and how, maybe we can leapfrog into a different new and old way of seeing our way in the world.
There are two stories on Spaceship Earth, a passenger story and a crew story. The passenger story is based on extraction, transaction, and distraction, and it's leading us towards collapse. The crew story is based on connection, cooperation, and participation. It leads towards regeneration.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with my dad, Dan Burgess.
Yeah, beautiful. I think that does give areas for hope that, because Western science is often seen as, at least in our sort of cultural modernity, that has the kind of power to inform, although on the same hand, like climate science doesn't always get listened to. But anyway, but the fact that those leading edges of Western science are validating what Indigenous cultures and probably our not so very ancient ancestors always knew, that we were part of an animate earth, and that our existence was relational. But yes, you'd hope that now that there's a kind of validation in the sort of hallowed halls of Western science, that we might, this whole way of perceiving might begin to open up faster. And I always find it fascinating, because actually, if you, at the same time, if it can feel like hard for people to understand, but why are so many people feeling horrified by what's going on in Gaza? Because we feel it, right? We might not know like who these people are, but we feel it. Like there's a connection. We actually feel that connectivity. I think there are kind of signs everywhere. I think there are sort of signals everywhere that when you sort of, if you looked at them or mapped them out, it would suggest that there is this, there is this understanding of this interconnection, this interdependence, that a healthy, caring, connected sort of global culture now, because of what we can all see, and it is sort of nobody's free and everyone's free. It's like we talk about with the Spaceship Earth. It's everybody or nobody. Do you know what I mean? There is this sort of sense of that interdependence, whether that's just in our mental states. Yeah.
I agree, but I also think there's a risk that sometimes we can be selective with our sympathy. And I think that is one of the reasons maybe we're in the climate crisis, because we're selective about how much we allow other people's pain to reach us, and all the realities of like the products we buy and the storylines behind those products, the supply chain behind those products. And like, if we really connected to the pain that's often in those stories that we might have read about and heard about, if we really open the empathy, we might have to make different choices about the products we use and buy, etc. And even in conflict, it seems that unfortunately people are often selective of which side they feel empathy towards, and ultimately I think that doesn't help move us toward the direction of reducing the conflict. And actually, how would it be if we were to hold space for all of the suffering? If everyone did that exercise, I wonder if that would help create a quicker pathway to peace. So no, these are just, questions to hold, but I agree with you. We have an amazing capacity to be empathetic to other people's pain. I just wonder if we're also sometimes selective about the pain we let in and the pain we don't.
Yeah, I think without a doubt, because I think, again, it comes back to all the contradictions, right? And it's how we experience, how we experience life, both what we see, but what we experience within us, around us, all the stories we're carrying, our ancestral stories, the stories of what we've been programmed with in the culture we're in. I mean, there's so much to consider. But I think what and again, my thought is just signals.
Well, I was just going to riff on actually what I felt like one of the things I got from Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings and the experience of Plum Village was that with the exercise we had to do, we had to imagine we were speaking to somebody we're in a conflict with, and really try our hardest to listen to their perspective, imagine their perspective, feel their feeling, so that we might allow some space to emerge for kind of common ground to appear. And so that reminds me too of in this idea of kind of collective empathy, how there's some empathy that comes very easily, for whatever reason, that we have particular sympathies, that some issues resonate, more clearly in our hearts. How would it be if we also try and expand that space? And imagine the experiences, or try to feel the feelings for the communities and the cultures and the areas that don't immediately speak to us. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I feel like there's something in his work and in Plum Village's teachings around this point that for me felt very, very hopeful of pathways of peace, both in our own personal lives, the small conflicts that we might find ourselves in life. You can't have world peace if you can't have peace in your house, in your neighborhood, in your immediate kind of environment. So both on the very, very kind of small, local, internal, personal level, that exercise, and then what that would mean on a global level, for global conflict. But yeah, I find there's a lot in his teachings that, for me, provide me a lot of hope. Pathways of peace in a very, it feels violent kind of time and conflict.
Yeah, I guess this is at least where my mind always struggles, because it's always, when you create spaces and communities of practice and you invite people in to explore these questions or explore these feelings, then, what I've experienced is pretty extraordinary shifts can occur. So it's kind of like, and that's not, that's just human technology. Do you know what I mean? It's creating the conditions and the space for people to surface uncomfortable things and not be judged, and to listen, and tools and practices. And so we come, I don't know, where for me, that's again, I guess, back to this piece of the relational and the solutions inside us that we're speaking to. But it's actually then how do these things continue to keep rippling? I mean, I know they are rippling, and people everywhere are working with all kinds of different ways of approaching these things we're speaking to. But I guess it's like there's always a sense that at the kind of big system level, it almost seems impossible in institutional power and whatever for these kinds of practices. You kind of think, well, what would happen now if what we see going on in Gaza and Israel, and we see, well, what, my mind often plays out, what would it look like if these people were in spaces where they were practicing these kinds of questions rather than reacting all the time, but sitting with, and of course that's not happening. But I do wonder there, because I kind of think, well, where does this stuff end? Do you know what I mean? So I'm fascinated with the sort of, as you say, these pathways, but what might accelerate these types of approaches? What do we need to get to for these types of approaches to be adopted? That's what they say at Plum Village, there's no way to peace. Peace is the way. It's like, it's sort of starting from that point of being able to get out of this stuck, binary, divisive energy, I guess, that feels very, still very dominant to me.
So we were at Plum Village early October, and the beginning of the latest outbreak of war in Palestine and Israel kicked off while we were there. It was quite surreal because we didn't have phones or access to the internet. We sort of learned about it in quite a layered way. And then a week or so afterwards, I was reading Thich Nhat Hanh's book, and I came across a paragraph he'd written about having Israelis and Palestinians at Plum Village together and doing work with them, and how through the space of a week and the process that they were sort of going through of deep listening with each other, it'd become possible for them to hold conversations and to start listening to each other, and I can't remember the word being used, but implying kind of some level of empathy was starting to emerge through those discussions. And of course that feels further away than ever right now in some ways, in a heartbreaking way. But just been trying to remember that example and those lessons, also of how we hold these conversations within ourselves and with our own community, because it's so easy to feel so strongly and emotionally, and we're seeing that emotion play out, and again polarization play out in the conversations around this topic. And I've been trying to practice feeling all those feelings, and also trying to hold some space for deep listening that pushes me sometimes beyond my comfort zones.
Yeah, thank you for that. It feels like so much of this is just how can we find ways for everyone to be heard, and listened to, and feels like there's a lot of medicine in just that, just that ability to really listen and hear without responding or judging or trying to sort of outmaneuver, but just to listen, and how much can come through that understanding that we can get through just listening.
And that is probably where I would root hope, is back in the kind of, like what we can do locally and internally, and the responsibility we can take in our own lives and our own relations and community. Almost every great activist leader in the past has coined a very similar phrase of like, all change begins within yourself. Gandhi, I think Martin Luther King, several of them have said that phrase in different ways, and I do really believe that probably is the key, and as we were exploring in Plum Village, if you were to go out trying to change things with anger and frustration and, you know, us and them mentality, like, well, they're doing it all wrong. That's the energy you're perpetuating and bringing to the world. And that's not to say that anger and the kind of, I think sometimes can be a positive, you know, it can have if it's deployed in the right way, can be a useful tool for creating challenge and change where it's needed. But we have to be very mindful, I think, that we don't just create an angry world, that we're trying to make a better world by being angry and try and practice the values that ultimately we want to grow into or towards in the world at large, that we're trying to practice and cultivate them in our own lives. I found myself quite angry yesterday. This is a good reminder to me. I didn't meditate yesterday and I was in an angry mood. So it's a good, saying all this is a good reminder to myself to take responsibility.
It's so true though what you're saying with the work of becoming. We call it practice driven change. It's just it's reminding ourselves that it's through the practice, right, or whatever that looks like for everyone has different practices, right? But the practice that brings us back to knowing that we are trying to create this future now by how we show up now. That's how things shift, not by projecting these kind of images of what we think the future might, you know what I mean? So that's a very big shift in behavior. Again, why I'm sort of interested in campaigning to sort of tell people that there's problems versus actually, you know, sort of funding and supporting kind of communities and people to start to practice these different ways of being, because actually that's where the future gets created, right? It's in the moment. I was listening last week to one of your podcast episode with Mr. Trudy and Kate Rayworth, and I can't remember what the question was, but it was something where it was sort of around the kind of like the urgency of, like, you know, change versus the kind of the urgency and the scale that we all get overwhelmed with, and then the kind of like being in the present. And I think she was speaking to the ripening, this idea that, you know, we're sort of seeding these changes for this future in the moment. Everyone has the ability to seed the seeds for this different world, right? This world, we're worlding a world of care and connection and diversity and empathy and compassion, but we might not be able to see it. We might not see it in our lifetimes. We probably won't, but actually the ripening will occur at some point in the future. I found that very helpful, actually, as a sort of, you know, moving into, again, thinking about I'm seeding for these fruits that will ripen at some point, which will happen across all of our systems if everyone's sort of working at that level in the capacity that, you know, each of us has the ability to influence something, right?
I remember I remember one of the sisters when they were talking about ripening at Plum Village, was talking about the monarch butterfly and how it does these like vast migration routes. And if I remember right, no butterfly will do the whole route in its lifetime, too far, but they'll breed across the route. And so across several generations, they'll make the route. And this idea of us in deep time, you know, that we might not, it's very unlikely that we'll see all the changes that we might wish for happen in our lifetime. And it's also impossible because we'll have different wishes, right? But if we make a step forward, a piece of the progress, then the next generation can continue, and the next generation, and over a vast extent of time, hopefully we're going in a better direction.
Yeah, beautiful. On that, do you have, I mean, you've talked a bit about meditation, but, you know, is there something that you could share, either that you've come across on your own journey that helps, that is, you know, it could be a practice or a provocation or an idea or anything that is exactly about that? It's something that you can do today that starts to move towards these, you know, envisioned better futures that we're working towards.
I think I would say meditation, because to me, it kind of goes back to this thing we're talking about of your own, being responsible for your own inner landscape, your own mindset, your own value system, and recognizing the kind of, the importance of that first and foremost, and then how that will then influence everything externally, from the choices you make, the actions you do, the work you do, but also the way you relate to people, strangers, family, etc. And there may be other ways people have of like connecting with themselves and analyzing themselves. But for me, meditation feels like a very straightforward way to do it, which is basically spending time with yourself and coming back to yourself. So yeah, I think that's a practice that feels to me very simple but important.
We have this story on this podcast of kind of, we're on this great big ecological, biological, mythological spaceship called planet Earth. There's this sort of idea that this culture, the modern culture, has kind of almost created more of a sort of passenger type story, you know, where we're sort of a bit more we've become quite passive. You know, the systems that have designed a sort of a way of kind of extraction, transaction, distraction. And we're trying to uphold and explore this
we can ring a
more
bell.
participative story.
We can ring a bell and somebody will bring us drinks and food.
Right. Exactly. And it's kind of
There's
like,
first class,
that passenger...
the economy.
Yeah. I always like to say those of us in the global north have been flying business class on Spaceship Earth for far too long. But we're understanding now that passenger story is incompatible with how the operating system on this spaceship works. And so the crew story is participative. It's about connecting. It's about cooperating. It's about participating in these shifts. And we use the word becoming because for us it's like we're never there. We're part of an ongoing evolutionary shift. Like all the more than human crew, they're all kind of doing their thing. And so this invitation of becoming crew, and I just always ask, for you, what does that bring up? This kind of like this invitation of becoming crew. What comes up for you with that provocation, that invitation?
What comes up is the image of washing dishes with you and enjoying it, you know?
I love that.
In more practical terms, I think, like, I read a quote years ago by Vandana Shiva about if everyone just had a small piece of earth that they looked after, how the world would change. And I'm trying to do that. So trying to look at like what piece of land is right for me to look after, how to approach that. And I'm excited for that journey. And funnily enough, I planted a whole bunch of the acorns from Thich Nhat Hanh's deck on your advice. Me and my daughter put them in little pots. And only one of them, I'm afraid to say, has germinated. But still, it's one. So all my hope now is in this one little oak seedling that I really hope I'm going to put into a piece of land at some point in the future. And so that's, I guess, maybe my equivalent of being crew of washing dishes on Spaceship Earth.
I love that. And my acorns have just started coming up. So I've got, because I bought quite a few back, and actually there's probably about 8, I think, that have emerged. I've still got
much
a few
more
other
successful
pots.
than me.
Well, I am a sort of oak growing geek. I've been doing sort of geeking out growing acorns for some years, but it's very exciting. I have to say, I'm like, well, this is the spirit of interbeing, right? I mean, there's surely these little oaklings.
What do you do about weed? If weeds grow up next to the oak seedling, what's your...
Pull them out.
You know what I mean? But interbeing, like, shouldn't they have their space? Interesting question, though.
It's a really good question. My sense, if they're in a small pot, then you want to give that oakling as much space as it can. I'm no sort of horticultural expert, but I am an experimenter, and I have sort of figured out that they tend to prefer, because they're still quite delicate down below, and I guess if there's a lot of other roots taking over the space, so I would take them out. Yeah, so that's the thing of interbeing, isn't it? How can the weed interbee with the oak sapling? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, even the concept of weeds is questionable, right? Who defines a weed?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Good question.
A lot of colonial horticulturists mainly, but
exactly.
So listen, great to have you here. Thank you for the time, and we shall be in touch.
Thank you. It was so lovely to chat to you.
Thanks, Lily. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Lily. So you know the score. If you enjoyed that conversation, maybe you could share it with a friend. Maybe you could post it on your socials. Maybe you could give us a little bit of feedback, send us an email, write a little comment on Instagram, get onto our Substack and start a little thready conversation. All of this stuff is super helpful because it helps spread the word about the Spaceship Earth podcast and the stories that we are seeding out into the world in these times, and the ideas and the connections and the projects and the people and the crew that we are all becoming together. All of this great swirling sort of interconnected mycelial mashup. It requires all of us. And so that would be just really beautiful if you might do something like that. Of course, if you've, haven't got anything out of this episode, then don't. But that would be lovely. And check it out. We've got over 100 episodes. There's kind of conversations with all kinds of extraordinary folks, and most of these conversations have a very long shelf life because we're working with very emergent possibilities and stories and ideas. So dig in, tell your friends, and say hi. We'd love to hear from you. And the best thing you can probably do is subscribe to our Substack, becomingcrew.substack.com. That way you get every new episode into your inbox. You'll hear about all of our Becoming Crew gatherings online. We've got some on-land experiences coming in the autumn. Lots of interesting stuff. So just subscribe to the Substack, and then that will be the most direct way of keeping in touch and becoming crew. So I'm going to play out with a track. This is from my dear friend Will Flisk, who I've featured a few times before on the podcast. Will is an artist, producer, based in North Devon in the UK. This track is called Satie and the Crow, featuring Sif August Dottir on vocals. I think I've got that right. I'll link to the tune on in the show notes. So until next time, look after yourself out there. Keep sort of entangling yourself with this more than human world, and peace and out.
This podcast is created in service to life, for you. It takes time, funds and energy to make. If you'd like to contribute to the running costs, you can donate the price of a cuppa or a pint. Find the link on our website. This podcast wouldn't exist without the following crew: Charlie Shred, Audio Jedi; Seaman Home Burgess, Engine Room; Willow Burgess, Jingles.
Aldrei vetrarnóttu á, einnig á hann í vistin, og einnig breyndi kokkin minn. Á sér krummi í vistin.
Let's see it.